In the winter of 2000, a man appeared on an obscure internet forum claiming he was from the year 2036. He spoke of civil wars, global collapse, and a secret technology buried in our past. At first, it sounded like a hoax until some of his predictions began to come true. Was this the world's most elaborate prank, or a genuine message from our future? Tonight, we unravel the chilling mystery of John Titor, a man who may have already lived through the disasters we're still waiting to face. If you believe the future leaves clues in the present, stay with me, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see tomorrow forever. It was the kind of night that feels like the world has forgotten to breathe. The hum of a computer tower was the only sound in a dimly lit apartment, somewhere on the outskirts of a city that didn't care if you existed. The year was 2000. The internet was still young, wild, and strangely intimate. A place where you could disappear into anonymous forums and feel as if you'd stumbled into private rooms scattered across the globe. He was there because he couldn't sleep. His name isn't important yet, because on that night, he was just another restless soul looking for distraction in the glow of a CRT monitor. The blue-white light painted his face as he clicked through threads about politics, war rumors, and strange technological theories that never seemed to leave the fringe. He liked the quiet hum of these late-night conversations, the way strangers would spill secrets they'd never say out loud to someone sitting across from them. Then it appeared. A post, buried halfway down a thread on a small-time discussion board that few people visited, carried the kind of subject line that usually got ignored: vague, cryptic, almost absurd. But something about it made him click. The username was strange: timetravel_0. No profile picture, no bio. The post began without introduction, without pleasantries, as if the writer knew exactly why they were there. My name is John Titor. I am a soldier, sent from the year 2036. There was no attempt to sell the drama with flourishes or capital letters. The words sat there like a quiet confession, but what followed turned that still night into something else entirely. Titor claimed he had been sent back in time as part of a military mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer, a piece of technology that, in his version of history, would be critical in debugging older software systems that had become vital again in the mid-21st century. The explanation was precise, technical, and unnervingly plausible. This wasn't the work of someone who had read a few articles and tried to spin a story. It was meticulous. But then the tone shifted. John Titor described a future that was fractured beyond recognition. A second American Civil War beginning in 2005. Global nuclear conflict in 2015. Entire cities gone in the blink of an eye. Food rationing, martial law, and communities stripped back to survival-level living. His words didn't read like speculative fiction. They read like debriefing notes from someone who had seen these things happen, someone who still carried the weight of them in his voice. Our sleepless man read on, the glow of the screen holding him in place. The way Titor wrote was different from the doomsday prophets he'd seen online before. There was no shouting. No "wake up, sheeple." No erratic jumps between conspiracy theories. Everything was laid out in calm, methodical order. He listed dates, locations, political fractures, even minor cultural changes that seemed so small. They almost had to be true. "I am not here to change your future," Titor wrote. "In my world line, you cannot. The future you experience will be yours, not mine. I am here for personal reasons and to pass on information in the hope it may help some of you survive." That was the first real hook, the sense that this wasn't about heroics or saving humanity. It was about inevitability. The man claimed that time didn't bend in the way people thought. The future wasn't a single thread you could unravel and reweave. Each decision, each event, branched off into another version of reality. In his reality, the war and the fire had already happened. Here, maybe it would again. Our man sat back in his chair. He could have closed the browser. He could have laughed it off. But something in the way Titor described the feel of the years to come, not just the events, but the texture of life in that fractured world, made him keep reading. The internet around them, vast as it seemed then, felt suddenly small, like a single candlelit room where the two of them were the only ones talking. There was more. Technical diagrams of the time machine Titor claimed to use. Specifications that matched real, verifiable physics principles, or at least skirted close enough to them to make you doubt your own skepticism. He described a system of rotating gravity distortion units powered by dual microsingularities. Words you wouldn't expect from a hoaxer looking for quick attention. And then, almost as if predicting the disbelief, he laid out the first challenge to anyone reading. You will say this is a story. That is fine. In the weeks to come, I will answer your questions. You can decide for yourself. Our man didn't sleep that night. He scrolled through responses as they trickled in. Some mocked him. Others tested him with obscure historical facts, only to be met with eerily specific answers. Titor would later post photos, grainy but oddly convincing, of his supposed time machine, bolted into the back of a car. He claimed it could move him to different points along a timeline, but never to change events in the way fiction promised. Outside, the world was still spinning in the ordinary way. The quiet city lights blinked against the horizon. But inside that dim apartment, something had shifted. The man didn't know it then, but he had just stumbled into what would become one of the internet's most enduring mysteries. Over the next months, Titor's posts would become a legend, dissected, archived, and re-archived, even as most people forgot the little corners of the web where they had first appeared. But on that night, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that somewhere out there, someone claimed to have seen our future. And the worst of it was that he didn't seem to be lying. The cursor blinked on the empty reply box. He hovered his fingers over the keys. In that pause, he felt the strange pull of history, or maybe inevitability. The first question he would type was simple, but it would lead him deeper than he ever imagined. It began quietly, almost too quietly for something that would later become one of the most enduring internet mysteries of the modern age. To anyone unfamiliar, it sounded like science fiction. But to those who looked closer, the claim raised unsettling questions. The IBM 5100 was a real machine, bulky, primitive by today's standards. But Titor asserted that it contained hidden functions unknown to the public, capabilities that would be critical in debugging legacy computer programs in his own timeline. At the time, most dismissed this as an eccentric fabrication. Years later, however, computer engineers confirmed that the IBM 5100 indeed possessed secret code translation features, information that was not widely known outside a small group of IBM employees in the 1970s. How could an anonymous poster in 2000 have known that? His descriptions of this future were clinical yet haunting. Cities in ruin, rural communities thriving in isolation, a fractured political map of what was once the United States. The most compelling and chilling element of Titor's online presence was not merely what he said, but how he said it. His posts read like a blend of military report, personal diary, and casual forum banter. He spoke of his time machine with technical specificity, describing it as a C204 gravity distortion unit built by General Electric, mounted inside a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette. He explained the mechanics of microsingularities, black holes harnessed for controlled time displacement. Whether the science was genuine or a web of convincing pseudophysics, it was detailed enough to captivate physicists, hobbyists, and skeptics alike. Over the weeks and months that followed, John Titor's name began to echo across forums and early internet communities. The questions poured in. Some wanted proof. Some wanted lottery numbers. Others pleaded for warnings about the future. He gave no winning numbers, but he did give predictions. or rather, glimpses. He spoke of a looming American civil conflict that would spiral into a global nuclear exchange by 2015, killing millions. He mentioned diseases that would re-emerge, the dangers of mad cow outbreaks, and an eventual reshaping of world politics. Many of his predictions did not occur as he described them, at least not in our timeline. And yet, there were smaller details that landed uncomfortably close to reality. The growing fear of global terrorism, the increasing polarization of American politics, even technological shifts like the miniaturization of electronics and the rise of decentralized networks. This is where the mystery deepened. Titor claimed that multiple world lines existed, parallel realities diverging from one another with each event. In other words, his predictions might not match our future, because we were not on the same path as his. It was the perfect shield against being proven wrong, or the perfect narrative trick to preserve a hoax. Then there was his exit. By March 2001, John Titor's posts slowed, then stopped. Before disappearing, he claimed he was returning to his own year. Mission completed. He left behind no photos beyond grainy, ambiguous images of his time machine and its components. No one knew who he was, where he was posting from, or why he had chosen that particular window in history to appear. What makes the John Titor case so enduring is not simply that it's a strange internet legend, it's that it sits at the crossroads of so many cultural fascinations: the idea of a fractured future, the seduction of forbidden technology, the lure of insider knowledge. His writing struck the perfect chord between possibility and paranoia. Enough fact to make you think twice. Enough fiction to keep you guessing. Some skeptics believe it was an elaborate role-playing exercise by a small group of collaborators with backgrounds in physics and computer science. Others believe it was the work of a single obsessive storyteller who happened to guess certain details right. And then there are those who still, to this day, entertain the possibility that John Titor was exactly who and what he claimed to be. 25 years after his alleged mission began, his digital fingerprints remain scattered across archived forums and websites, a preserved ghost of early internet culture. Researchers have tracked posts, cross-referenced IP logs, and analyzed writing style, but no definitive identity has been uncovered. The man, or myth, remains as untouchable now as he was in 2001. And that may be the true genius of John Titor. Whether hoaxer or harbinger, he created a story so tightly wound in mystery and so carefully balanced between reality and invention that disproving it feels almost irrelevant. The question is no longer, was John Titor real? But why do we still want him to be? Because perhaps, buried within all the speculation, is a seed of something more unsettling than a simple fabrication. The possibility that a stranger from the future did try to warn us, and that we simply ignored him. John Titor didn't just claim to be a time traveler. He left behind a trail of statements that read like cryptic roadmaps to our future. They weren't delivered as grand proclamations, but as casual remarks scattered across internet forums between 2000 and 2001. They were buried among discussions about physics, time machine schematics, and offhand jokes, yet, in hindsight, some of these remarks feel less like idle chatter and more like warnings. He spoke of a coming fracture in the United States, not a neat split, but an ideological tearing so deep that neighbor would turn against neighbor. At the time, the early 2000s felt relatively stable for most Americans, save for whispers of political tension. His words seemed like standard internet paranoia. But years later, as polarization grew sharper, protests more volatile, and election cycles more vicious, many began to revisit those old posts. The language he used, two very different visions of America, sharing the same borders, now reads less like a metaphor and more like a diagnosis. Titor's most infamous political prediction involved the Second American Civil Conflict, starting with unrest and localized skirmishes in the mid-2000s and escalating in the following decade. While no official civil war has erupted, the parallels are difficult to ignore. From 2014 onward, the streets of American cities have been filled with demonstrations, riots, and standoffs between groups that see each other not as fellow citizens, but as enemies of the state. Even the phrase "two countries in one," once reserved for fringe pundits, has seeped into mainstream discourse. Then there were his technological claims. Titor spoke of a future where communication devices would be worn on your person, displaying information instantly in your field of vision and capable of connecting to any system anywhere. In 2000, smartphones didn't exist in the way we know them now. The idea of holding a small, always online, information-rich device sounded like science fiction. Yet by the late 2000s, the iPhone arrived, and within a decade, augmented reality headsets and eye assistants followed. The eerie part? His description wasn't just about the technology itself, but about its effect. He warned that such devices would make truth harder to find, not easier, as if predicting the age of misinformation, deepfakes, and algorithm-driven realities. Some predictions were almost too obscure to take seriously at the time. He mentioned an illness that would emerge and change the way people gather, the way they trust proximity. He never called it a pandemic, nor did he give it a name. It was one of dozens of odd remarks lost in his sprawling online exchanges. But in 2020, when COVID-19 shut down borders, emptied streets, and rewrote social norms, some of his followers began combing his old messages with renewed urgency. Geopolitics was another area where his statements raise eyebrows. He predicted heightened conflict in the Middle East, specifically involving Iraq, years before the U.S. invasion in 2003. He mentioned the rise of new alliances in Asia, hinting at tensions between China and its neighbors that would reshape global trade routes. In 2000, the idea of China dominating global manufacturing technology and military presence was still viewed by many as a long-term possibility, not an imminent shift. Yet here we are. Of course, skeptics argue that many of these forecasts could be explained by probability and educated guessing. After all, political division, pandemics, and technological leaps aren't impossible to foresee. But what unsettles people is the level of detail in some of his descriptions, not the broad strokes, but the way he seemed to speak from the vantage point of someone who had already seen the headlines. And then there's the one prediction that hasn't happened, the one that keeps Titor's story alive like a faint pulse in the dark. Titor spoke of a major global event in the mid-2020s, a sudden, irreversible change that would alter human civilization's trajectory. He never fully explained it, only hinting that it would be both a tragedy and a necessity, and that its cause would come from above. Interpretations vary wildly. Some think it's a reference to climate collapse, unprecedented storms, rising seas, and food shortages. Others point toward the possibility of a large-scale asteroid event, or even contact with something not of this Earth. And there are those who believe it refers to a human-made disaster, a catastrophic failure in artificial intelligence or global infrastructure. The exact phrasing he used has haunted researchers for decades. You will not fear the beginning. You will fear the silence that follows. No one knows what he meant. Was it metaphorical? Literal? The internet has spent 2 decades trying to decode that one sentence, and each passing year makes the urgency feel sharper. We are now in the window he claimed this event would occur. And as the months tick by, his words hang like a shadow over every headline about climate anomalies, cyber attacks, and unidentified aerial phenomena. It's easy to dismiss Titor as a hoax, a clever fiction spun by an anonymous poster who knew how to stir curiosity. But if that's the case, then he also possessed a rare talent for tapping into the undercurrents of the world's future fears. And perhaps that's why his story endures. It's not simply because some of his statements appear to have come true, but because he framed them not as prophecies, but as inevitabilities. If you believe him, then the next act of his timeline is not something you can prepare for in a conventional sense. If you don't believe him, then perhaps you can write off his words as coincidence or pattern seeking by an audience desperate for meaning. But deep down, even the skeptics can't ignore that one unfulfilled prediction. It hangs there like a locked door in a long abandoned building, the kind you're not sure you want to open, but can't stop staring at. And according to Titor, we're almost at the point where that door will swing wide. When the first cryptic messages from John Titor appeared online, they were easy to dismiss, another eccentric voice in the digital wilderness of early internet forums. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. His claims began threading themselves into conversations across multiple message boards. Dates, historical events, obscure technical references, too specific to ignore. It wasn't long before the internet birthed its own unofficial task force, an army of digital detectives. They weren't connected by any central authority. Instead, they were drawn together by a mixture of curiosity, obsession, and the lingering, uncomfortable question: what if he's telling the truth? They began with the obvious, tracing the IP addresses linked to his posts. At first, the results seemed promising. A handful of locations scattered across the United States, some pointing to ordinary residential areas. But almost immediately, things turned strange. Several IP traces led to servers that no longer existed. One forum admin swore that the hosting company had gone out of business years earlier. Yet somehow, Titor's messages had been posted only weeks ago. Then came the writing style analysis. Linguists and codebreakers combed through his posts, identifying patterns in phrasing, syntax, and vocabulary. He wrote in a way that was simultaneously precise and detached, as if every word was weighed before it was placed. One investigator compared his language to military communication manuals from the late 20th century. Another noticed an odd blend of cultural references, some rooted firmly in the past, others strangely aligned with ideas and technologies that hadn't yet entered the mainstream. But the more they studied him, the more the trail seemed to twist back on itself. Archives containing early posts vanished without warning. Entire forum threads were erased overnight, sometimes by the original moderators, and sometimes by no one who would admit to doing it. A particularly well-known investigator named Larry Haber claimed he had downloaded full logs of Titor's conversations, only for the files to become corrupted beyond recovery within days. His explanation was simple. I didn't delete them. Something else did? The sleuths dug deeper, hunting for inconsistencies. They found some. Dates that shifted slightly between versions of the same story. Descriptions of future events that, when reread months later, seemed to have been edited to match real-world outcomes. To some, this was proof that the entire affair was an elaborate hoax. But to others, it was something far more unnerving, evidence that the timeline itself was changing. One researcher, posting under the alias Ocelot42, claimed to have compared cached versions of Titor's predictions stored across different internet archives. The variations were subtle, but unmistakable. Certain sentences didn't exist in earlier versions. A prediction about the outbreak of a conflict in the Middle East appeared in one set of archives, but not in another, even though both were supposedly from the same date. If Titor really was from a future shaped by branching timelines, this was exactly what one might expect to see. Subtle shifts in recorded history as timelines overlapped and diverged. Even more unsettling was the human element. Several prominent investigators began receiving anonymous emails warning them to drop it. A Florida-based journalist who had been interviewing Titor's supposed relatives suddenly stopped publishing any material on the case. When contacted months later, he claimed to have moved on from the story and refused to elaborate. And then there was the case of the disappearing posts. On at least 3 separate occasions, forum administrators swore that Titor's posts had been manually deleted from their servers, yet the deletion logs contained no entries. In one incident, the physical hard drives were checked, and there was no trace of the posts ever existing at all. It was as if the words had been pulled out of reality itself. Speculation about Titor's true identity ran wild. Some believed he was an elaborate government psyop designed to test public reaction to future scenarios. Others argued he was part of a time travel experiment gone rogue, using primitive early 2000s internet boards as a safe channel of communication. A smaller, more conspiratorial faction believed he was never human at all, that John Titor was an advanced AI program seeded into the early internet to manipulate and study human behavior. Despite endless theories, one truth became clear. The deeper the investigators dug, the less solid the ground beneath them felt. This wasn't just a case of identifying a hoaxer or confirming a prophet. It was as if they were chasing something that existed halfway between reality and fiction, refusing to fully reveal itself in either. By the time mainstream media caught wind of the story, many of the original posts were already gone, living only in scattered screenshots and half-remembered quotes. A few dedicated archivists swore they had backups, but curiously, many of those drives suffered sudden failures before they could be made public. And then, nothing. No more posts from Titor, no more cryptic predictions. Just a hollow silence where his words once appeared. For most, the investigation hit a dead end. But a small number of die-hard researchers noticed something chilling. A final post, barely acknowledged at the time, hinted that his mission in this timeline was almost complete. It ended with a short, almost mocking farewell. "We will meet again in a place you don't yet know exists." Even now, those words linger like a splinter in the mind, because if the investigation taught anyone anything, it was this: the man from 2036 didn't just leave questions behind. He left holes in the fabric of our digital history. Time travel has always walked a thin line between myth and mathematics, a concept often dismissed as fiction, yet stubbornly clinging to the fringes of legitimate physics. To understand the man who called himself John Titor, we must first enter that narrow space, where speculative theory begins to blur with possibility. Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, published in 1915, reshaped our understanding of time and space. It told us that time is not a universal constant, ticking identically for everyone. Instead, it bends, stretches, and warps alongside the fabric of space itself. In this framework, time is not an unshakable arrow, but a dimension woven into the very geometry of the universe. And like any surface, it can, in theory, be twisted. Some physicists have proposed that if space-time can be bent enough, perhaps by a massive rotating object, it could loop back on itself, creating what's called closed time-like curve. In such a loop, a traveler could, at least mathematically, return to an earlier point in time. This is not fantasy drawn from novels. It is a logical, if controversial, extension of Einstein's equations. This brings us to the Kerr black hole, a theoretical spinning singularity predicted in 1963 by mathematician Roy Kerr. Unlike the static black holes we usually imagine, Kerr black holes have angular momentum. Their immense rotation could drag space-time around them in a violent swirl, creating corridors where the laws of cause and effect fold unnaturally. Some physicists speculate that such structures might function like cosmic time tunnels, provided one could survive the journey. John Titor's descriptions of his so-called C204 time displacement unit were not the ramblings of a man quoting comic books. They contained technical details that, eerily, mirrored speculative papers circulating in scientific circles of the late 20th century. He spoke of microsingularities, artificially created black holes, harnessed to distort spacetime. At the time of his postings, this was a concept discussed only in obscure research notes and fringe physics conferences, far from public knowledge. In his account, the C204 device was mounted inside a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette and powered by twin microsingularities contained within magnetic housing units. It generated a controlled gravitational field, pulling the vehicle into a pre-calculated time displacement. While it may sound cinematic, some elements strangely matched ongoing research into gravitational frame dragging and the manipulation of high-energy particle fields. Physics offers one crucial problem: to create even a single black hole, micro or otherwise, one would require energies far beyond anything humanity could produce, even today. But Titor addressed this, claiming that in his timeline, breakthroughs in particle acceleration and containment had made it possible to stabilize microsingularities for brief periods. He described radiation shielding, emergency cutoffs, and a cooling system eerily similar to proposals found years later in experimental reactor designs. Of course, there are deep contradictions. For one, microsingularities are not known to exist naturally, and even if they could be artificially generated, their evaporation via Hawking radiation would be almost instantaneous. Containing them, as Titor described, would require not only revolutionary materials, but also control over gravity itself, a feat humanity is nowhere near achieving. Yet the most unsettling detail isn't the feasibility, but the specificity. Titor didn't simply say, "I used a time machine." He listed manufacturer names, model numbers, and military procurement codes. He spoke of the General Electric Time Displacement Unit, Model C204, as if it were a mundane piece of equipment. This is where the mystery deepens. Some amateur investigators have claimed that the serial numbers he mentioned match internal coding structures used by General Electric in the late 90s. Why would someone fabricating a hoax go to such lengths for technical accuracy, unless he had studied, or perhaps even worked within, an environment that trafficked in advanced physics? The investigative threads only tangle further when you compare Titor's accounts to archived NASA and CERN discussions from around the same era. In a few cases, speculative engineering diagrams for space-time distortion devices bear an uncanny resemblance to Titor's crude sketches. These documents were not public at the time of his postings. Yet Titor described their principles, including rotating singularities, gravity sensors, and cesium clock calibration, with unnerving precision. Time travel theories, however, come with an unforgiving paradox: the problem of causality. If one could journey to the past, even the smallest interference could change the chain of events leading to the traveler's own existence. This grandfather paradox has troubled physicists and philosophers for decades. Titor had an answer. He claimed that his journeys did not change his own past, but instead created alternate timelines branching off from the moment of arrival. This, too, mirrors interpretations of Hugh Everett's many worlds theory, which was not mainstream popular knowledge in the early 2000s. If Titor was an elaborate hoax, it was one armed with the formidable grasp of speculative physics, decades ahead of the average science fiction enthusiast. If he was genuine, then his machine was not only possible, but already built and used. Both scenarios lead to uncomfortable questions. As the online community dissected his claims, they discovered contradictions, gaps, and occasional errors, yet the core of his scientific narrative remained strangely resilient. Unlike most pseudoscience, it could not be immediately dismissed as ignorance. Instead, it sat in the gray zone where reality's edges fray into the untested. In the end, whether John Titor was a brilliant fraud or a displaced traveler from 2036, his story forces us to confront an uneasy truth. The boundary between impossible and inevitable is often thinner than we care to admit. We might laugh at the notion of a man driving a vintage Corvette through the folds of time, until physics itself catches up with the fiction. And if even 1% of his science holds water, then somewhere in our future, a machine capable of stepping beyond the present moment may already exist. The only question left is, who will use it first? It is tempting to believe that John Titor's story is an anomaly, a singular voice echoing from a timeline we will never touch. But his name is not alone in the archives of temporal oddities. Long before the internet wrapped the globe in its invisible threads, whispers of time travelers surfaced in unexpected places, each stranger than the last. And together, they weave an unsettling pattern. The first thread takes us to January 28, 2003. Federal investigators announced the arrest of a man named Andrew Carlson, a quiet, unremarkable figure who, according to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, had turned an initial investment of just $800 into $350 million in barely 2 weeks. The stock market, volatile and punishing to the unprepared, had bent to his will as if he were reading from a script no one else could see. Carlson's trades were so flawless, so precise, that authorities were certain they had caught the most sophisticated insider trader in history. But what Carlson allegedly told them in custody defied all legal precedent and all reason. He claimed he was not from our time at all, but from the year 2256. Every winning trade, he said, was the result of historical research from his own century. He spoke of future events that investigators later admitted were disturbingly accurate. Then, before the case could be brought to trial, Carlson disappeared. No prison records, no court transcripts, just a vanishing act, as though he had stepped neatly out of history. Skeptics called it a hoax, a tabloid invention. But no one could quite explain why the sect never conclusively denied the story. From Carlson's glass towers of Wall Street, the next thread drops us onto the rain-slicked streets of New York City in 1951, where a mystery would unfold that still leaves historians divided. Police officers were called to the scene of a fatal traffic accident. The victim was a man in his late 20s, dressed in clothes that had not been fashionable for half a century. A waistcoat, high-collared shirt, and a silk top hat. His pockets contained a copper token for a beer worth 5 cents, bearing the name of a saloon that had closed in 1870. He carried a bill for horse care, a letter dated 1876, and no documents that tied him to the modern world. Fingerprint records yielded nothing. And then, as detectives combed through missing persons archives, they found a chilling match. Rudolph Fentz, who had vanished without a trace in 1876. Witness statements from the time claimed he had simply walked out one night for a cigar and never returned. How could a man disappear in 1876 and reappear dead in 1951, unchanged by age? Theories swirled: a prank, a mistaken identity, a fabrication. But there is a reason the Fentz case endures. It is because it refuses to die, living on in police folklore, passed down like an urban legend too strange to discard. Yet perhaps the most haunting of these tales does not involve a man stepping forward in time, but a machine reaching backward. Hidden in the whispered corridors of Vatican rumor is the legend of the chronovisor. According to accounts from the 1960s, this device was said to have been constructed by a team of scientists, including the Italian priest and physicist Father Pellegrino Ernetti. It was not a time machine in the traditional sense. It did not transport bodies. Instead, it claimed to see through time, tuning into the electromagnetic echoes of the past and future, much as a radio receives distant stations. The chronovisor, they said, could project these visions onto a screen. Ernetti reportedly used it to witness Napoleon addressing his troops, ancient Roman markets in full color, and most controversially, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. If true, such a machine would collapse the very concept of historical uncertainty. Every mystery solved, every secret laid bare. But according to the story, the Vatican dismantled the chronovisor, fearing its power. Ernetti himself later recanted, though many suspect he did so under immense pressure. The Church has never confirmed the device's existence, nor denied it outright. Place these stories alongside John Titor's claims, and the timeline grows tangled. Carlson's uncanny market foresight, Fentz's displacement across 75 years, the Vatican's alleged ability to peer into epochs long gone. They are disparate fragments. And yet, all share a quiet defiance of the rules we live by. They are threats to the smooth, linear flow of time, suggesting that history is less a river than an ocean, with currents that loop, double back, and occasionally collide. Skeptics will point to hoaxes, misinterpretations, or the human desire to embroider dull reality with impossible color. And it is true. Each of these cases carries shadows of doubt. Carlson's arrest is said to have originated in a satirical news source. Fence's file may have been the invention of a science fiction writer. Ernetti's chronovisor could be no more than allegory dressed in circuitry. Yet something curious happens when such stories accumulate. Even if each individual tale collapses under scrutiny, the pattern remains, as if reality itself is quietly feeding us echoes of a deeper truth, one fragment at a time. For believers, these accounts are breadcrumbs scattered through history, evidence that the boundaries of time are not as fixed as we think. For others, they are proof only of our endless fascination with breaking those boundaries, of the human hunger for what lies just beyond the next moment. But in both interpretations, the effect is the same. John Titor is no longer a lone figure. He is part of a lineage, a shadow network of alleged travelers, each leaving a mark too strange to dismiss entirely. And this is where the tension builds. Because if even one of these stories is true, if Carlson's prophets were indeed carved from the future, if Fence's body truly leapt from the 19th century, if the Vatican once watched history like a film reel, then Titor's warning is not the first, and will not be the last. Perhaps these figures are not anomalies at all, but agents of a recurring phenomenon. Perhaps they are pieces of the same puzzle, scattered across centuries, waiting for us to notice that they fit together. The unsettling part is not whether these accounts can be verified. The unsettling part is the possibility that they can, and someone has made sure they aren't. It is here, in the shadows between fact and fiction, that John Titor's legend takes on its most unsettling shape. For every person who believed his story without question, there was another who dissected it, tracing his words back through IP addresses, email headers, and forgotten internet forums. What they found only deepened the mystery. The first theory, one that refuses to die even decades later, suggests Titor was never a lone traveler from the year 2036, but rather the manufactured voice of a psychological operation, a government test. In this scenario, his chilling predictions about civil war, nuclear strikes, and global collapse weren't warnings from the future, but carefully crafted stress tests. Imagine this: a quiet experiment run through the primitive internet of the early 2000s, measuring how far doomsday narratives could spread and how people would react. Every time-stamped forum post, every technical detail about his supposed time machine, every answer to the hundreds of questions posed to him could have been scripted by analysts behind the curtain, observing, recording, learning. Supporters of this theory point to one unsettling detail. Titor's story stopped almost as abruptly as it began. No farewell, no long goodbye, just silence. And then, strange things happened in the background. A few of the most active forum users, people who interacted with Titor extensively, stopped posting entirely. Their usernames, once daily contributors, went dark within weeks. Some investigators claimed these individuals were contacted privately and warned to stop digging. Whether that's paranoia or truth, no one knows for sure. The second theory takes a more human turn. What if John Titor wasn't a government agent, but an elaborate role play orchestrated by a small group of internet-savvy tricksters? Back then, online anonymity was far easier to maintain. A skilled group could operate under a single identity, with one posting technical schematics, another answering personal questions, and yet another weaving the emotional backstory of a soldier sent back to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer. The technical knowledge Titor displayed, especially about the IBM 5100's undocumented functions, could have been gathered from obscure tech archives, insider contacts, or even retired engineers. This theory gains strength from the work of Larry Hauber, a Florida entertainment lawyer whose family members were linked to the original Titor website. Hauber denied being Titor, but skeptics found it suspicious that he controlled the legal rights to the name John Titor and related merchandising. To them, it looked like someone had turned a strange internet curiosity into a carefully protected brand. Yet, there's a problem with the prank theory. If it was all for laughs, why did it maintain such discipline? Why did the story avoid the usual internet hoax pitfalls? No sudden absurdity, no breaking of character, no monetization at the time of peak interest. Instead, the Titor persona remained consistent, almost unnervingly so, across hundreds of posts. The answers were calm, deliberate, sometimes cryptic, never devolving into comedy or self-reveal. That kind of restraint is rare in hoaxes. The third theory is the one believers hold to with quiet conviction. John Titor was exactly who he claimed to be, a soldier from the year 2036 sent back on a mission. The idea sounds absurd until you examine the details that lined up eerily with real events. For example, his warning about future U.S. conflict seemed far-fetched in the calm days of the early 2000s. Yet in the years after his disappearance, the country saw deepening political division, civil unrest, and cultural fractures, enough for his followers to whisper, "It's happening." Then there was his technical description of his time machine. He named specific components: dual positive singularities, microsingularities stabilized by electron injection, terms that, at the time, sounded like gibberish to most readers. Years later, physicists and engineers noted that while not exact science, the language he used was strangely adjacent to real theoretical physics concepts about time travel via Kerr black holes. This theory has its own shadows. If Titor was real, who sent him? Was it the U.S. government of 2036? A global authority? Or something far more secret? And why, above all, did he reveal his presence so openly? Some point to his own words, "I am here for personal reasons." He claimed his mission was to recover an IBM 5100 for debugging legacy code, but hinted that seeing his younger self and family was his true motivation. The deeper you look, the more you notice names tied to his trail. A K. Titor surfaced briefly online, claiming to be his mother. The claim was dismissed as part of the hoax theory, yet her details matched fragments from Titor's own posts. Another name appears in archived forums: Oliver Williams, who ran one of the most comprehensive John Titor sites. Williams said he never met Titor, yet his dedication to preserving the posts was obsessive. Some believe he knew more than he admitted. And then there are the ghost users, handles you find only in connection to Titor threads, never before or after, as if they logged on, played their part, and vanished from the internet entirely. Theories overlap, intertwine, and contradict each other. If Titor was a POP, then the government learned exactly how fast an idea could spread and how deeply it could take root. If it was a prank, then it stands as one of the most disciplined and enduring hoaxes in internet history. If he was real, then his story is a crack in the wall of our understanding. Proof that time isn't as linear as we believe. What makes the Titor case different from other hoaxes or urban legends is that it has no official resolution. There was no confession, no definitive debunk. The trail ends in silence, and that silence is what keeps people coming back. In the end, whether John Titor was a government test, a bored genius playing with an early internet audience, or a genuine visitor from 2036, the effect was the same. He made thousands, maybe millions, of people question the reality they were living in. And perhaps that was the real mission all along. He spoke of the future as if it were a place he had walked through barefoot, feeling every shard of glass beneath his feet. His words weren't the polished warnings of a politician or the abstract predictions of a scientist. They were jagged, specific, and disturbingly ordinary. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. The future he described wasn't an alien apocalypse or a cinematic end times fantasy. It was something we could almost imagine happening next year or next month. According to his account, the year 2036 was not defined by one singular catastrophe, but by a slow, grinding collapse of trust between governments and their people, between neighbors, between families themselves. Civil unrest wasn't a sudden spark, but a long, smoldering ember that finally caught fire. He spoke of streets where armored vehicles patrolled not to keep out invaders, but to keep in citizens. Curfews, checkpoints, lines of silent people holding ration cards under skies that never seemed to clear. It wasn't the chaos of war that frightened him. It was the order, the oppressive, calculated kind. Surveillance woven into the fabric of daily life so seamlessly that people forgot it was there. Not cameras on poles or security guards in dark uniforms, but data. Your purchases, your movements, your conversations, all feeding into systems that didn't just watch you, they knew you. They predicted you. In his telling, the architecture of this surveillance had already been built in our time, brick by brick, app by app. The people of 2036 weren't dragged into submission. They walked willingly, trading pieces of privacy for the illusion of safety until they had nothing left to trade. And by the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. But the truly haunting detail wasn't just what he claimed was coming, it was how he chose to say it. The warnings were not shouted from rooftops. They were not delivered to the steps of the United Nations or broadcast in some viral video. They were dropped quietly into the corners of obscure internet forums, scattered among casual replies, layered in technical jargon and cryptic phrasing, almost as if he didn't want to be believed, or couldn't risk being taken seriously. Those who analyzed his messages claimed that his vagueness was deliberate, that revealing too much could fracture the very timeline he came to protect. Others suspected it was a test, a cruel experiment to see whether human nature could recognize danger without having it screamed in their faces. After all, history is filled with ignored warnings. Telegrams before Pearl Harbor, intelligence before 9/11s, seismologists' reports before earthquakes. The future, it seems, has always whispered before it screams. He also spoke of a cultural fracture, one that began in the years we are living through now. Information itself became the battleground. Truth, a shifting, weaponized thing. People didn't just disagree on solutions. They disagreed on reality itself. Every photograph could be faked. Every voice could be cloned. Every headline could be a trap. And in that fog of uncertainty, power consolidated in the hands of those who could control the narrative. But beneath the political and technological shadows, his description carried a quieter, more personal dread, the collapse of intimacy. People stopped meeting in person. Neighborhoods became clusters of strangers. Children grew up knowing more about celebrities on the other side of the planet than the people living next door. It wasn't a war of bombs, it was a war on connection. And yet, for all the weight of his warning, he gave no clear solution, no rallying cry, no single event to prevent. Just the broad strokes of a world unraveling under its own arrogance and complacency. Some saw that as proof of a hoax. After all, a real-time traveler would want to change things. Others saw it as proof of its authenticity, because maybe he knew nothing could change. Still, one question lingers even now. What if the message was never meant for everyone? What if it was meant for a handful of people who could read between the lines? Those who could influence the future quietly, without drawing the wrong kind of attention. A surgeon's touch instead of a soldier's fist. The unsettling truth is that his words, whether they came from 2036 or the imagination of someone in our own time, mirrored patterns we've seen before. Societies that surrendered freedoms for security. Leaders who rose not by force, but by promising to protect people from dangers they couldn't see. Civilizations that rotted not from foreign invasion, but from the inside out. The man from 2036, or the man claiming to be, never stayed long enough to see the impact of his warnings. He disappeared from the forums as abruptly as he appeared, leaving only fragments behind. And perhaps that was the point. Maybe the silence was the final message, that the future doesn't change because of one voice. It changes when enough people decide to listen before it's too late. If you believe him, then 2036 is not far. The shadows he described are already at our feet. And the most terrifying part? We might not notice when they finally swallow us whole. They say digital footprints last forever, that once something touches the internet, it's immortal. But that belief is a comforting illusion, because if you follow the trail of John Titor, you'll learn that even in the vast, unforgetting memory of cyberspace, things can be erased. It began without warning. His posts, which had appeared almost daily in those strange, obsessive bursts, grew less frequent. His tone shifted, more cautious, more deliberate. On one forum, his replies grew shorter, as if the urgency to share had been replaced by a growing fear of saying too much. Then, one evening in March of 2001, the stream of words simply stopped. No farewell, no final statement, just silence. In the weeks that followed, those who had spoken to him scrambled to piece together a timeline. They compared message board backups, private emails, even handwritten notes they'd made in late-night chat rooms. But an odd pattern emerged. Certain threads had vanished entirely, not locked, not archived, gone, as if someone had reached into the machinery of the internet and plucked them out, leaving only gaps where the conversations should have been. Some blamed server glitches. Others believed the moderators, tired of conspiracy theorists and hoaxes, had purged the boards. But there was a third, quieter theory, one that most were too uneasy to say aloud, that the disappearance wasn't about cleaning up clutter. It was about removing a signal before too many people could decode it. The most striking detail came from an old sysadmin who claimed to have monitored the hosting server during Titor's final week. According to him, there were unusual access logs, not from the US, but from a string of encrypted nodes scattered across Europe and Asia. These weren't casual users. They were systematic, targeted, pulling specific chunks of data from old backups. Not just Titor's posts, but the replies that referenced him. Almost like someone was reconstructing the conversation in real time, and then deleting the original source. Around the same time, two forum regulars reported something stranger. They claimed they'd received emails from Titor himself, not through the forums, but directly to their private inboxes. The messages were short, cryptic. One read, "Stop looking for me. The window is closed." The other contained nothing but a string of numbers and a date that has since passed without any event that the public could recognize. Whether these emails were genuine or an elaborate prank remains uncertain, but both recipients swore they recognized the writing style. By April 2001, the internet's chatter about Titor had slowed to a trickle. New visitors found only fragments of the original threads, many hosted on personal fan pages or mirrored forums. Yet even these were unstable. One by one, mirror sites went offline. Some claimed domain expirations. Others suffered sudden, catastrophic server failures. The odds of all of them disappearing within months felt unnatural. And then there was the radio interview. The last recorded public appearance of John Titor, or at least someone claiming to be him, aired in the spring of 2001 on a late-night AM station. The host described the voice as calm, deliberate, and slightly distorted, as if passed through a filter. Titor spoke of threads unraveling and the need to realign. The most haunting part came near the end, when the host asked if he would return to speak again. The response, "You'll hear from me when the divergence is irreversible." The line crackled with static, and then the call dropped. No further calls came. In the decades since, researchers, archivists, and amateur sleuths have tried to rebuild the Titor record from the scraps that survived. Some succeeded in reconstructing almost full threads from old Google cache files, only to find that the moment they publicized their work, the caches went missing. A few even reported their personal computers behaving strangely, files disappearing overnight, external drives failing without warning. Was this the hand of a government agency? A secretive group protecting classified research? Or was it something far stranger, something that really did not belong to our own timeline? The deeper you dive, the more the edges of the story blur. Witnesses vanish from forums. Email addresses go dead. Even the names of those who once swore they'd spoken to him fade from the community's memory, as if scrubbed from the collective record. It's this vanishing act, quiet, methodical, unnervingly precise, that leaves the final mark. Today, the name John Titor survives mostly as a ghost story in the annals of internet history. A case study for time travel enthusiasts, a curiosity for digital archivists. But for those who were there, who read the words as they were first posted, there remains a quiet, stubborn certainty that something real happened, and that someone made sure we'd never see the full picture. Because in the end, the last known traces of John Titor aren't the surviving forum screenshots or the archived PDFs. They're the missing pieces, the unexplained gaps, as sudden silences in the places where the truth might have lived. And if you believe in his warnings, then maybe that's the most telling detail of all. Not that he vanished, but that he had to. The year 2036 exists in our minds like a phantom gate, far enough to feel unreal, close enough to reach out and touch. We imagine it the way a prisoner imagines the day of release, distant, hazy, a promise that might be broken. But what if it is not just a date in the calendar? What if it is an address? And someone from that address has already knocked on our door? We tell ourselves stories of time travel as if they are fairy tales for adults, comforting in their impossibility. The paradoxes, the equations, the theoretical physics, they keep the concept safely locked behind the glass of science fiction. But there's a danger in that comfort, because history has shown that the human race only truly sees what it believes it is ready to see. Airplanes, submarines, space travel, all dismissed as absurd until the day they weren't. In the early 2000s, when John Titor's words began to spread through obscure corners of the internet, the world was different. People saw it as a novelty, a curious blend of conspiracy and fiction. But he left details, not vague prophecies like the back of a fortune cookie, but schematics, technical descriptions, fragments of a future too specific to ignore. He spoke of civil unrest in America, of a fractured union, of global instability, and a looming war that would carve history into before and after. The uncomfortable truth is, some of what he spoke of has already happened, and that's where the real unease begins. Imagine for a moment that every word he said was the truth. Not an elaborate hoax, not an internet game, but the desperate dispatch of a man sent back across the timeline, carrying knowledge like a smuggled package. Imagine that the fractures in our world today, the political divides, the technological overreach, the shadow conflicts we barely see, are not random, but the early tremors of the earthquake he warned us about. If the warning was real, then 2036 is not a mystery to be solved. It's a verdict to be delivered. And here's the uncomfortable question. If we knew the future, could we change it? History doesn't give us much hope. Civilizations have received warnings before, from prophets, scientists, witnesses to disasters waiting to happen, and most have been ignored. The Trojans were warned about the horse. The engineers warned about the Titanic's rivets. Climate scientists have been warning for decades. The pattern is old, predictable, and cruel. We hear the warning, we nod, and we wait until the disaster makes the choice for us. But what if, for once, the warning is clear enough, urgent enough, that we actually listen? What if someone in the early 2000s did believe John Titor? Maybe they started making choices differently. Maybe they prepared in silence, just as some families did before the pandemic of 2020, storing supplies, learning old skills, cutting ties with the fragile systems we all depend on. In that possibility, the timeline is no longer a single road, it's a branching tree. One path follows the world Titor described: war, collapse, and a rebirth from ashes. The other is unknown, a future that exists only if enough people make enough changes in the right moments. And that brings us to the paradox of the time traveler's burden. If his warning changes the future, then the future he came from might never exist, which means perhaps he never comes back, which means perhaps we never hear the warning. It's the loop that haunts every theory of time travel. And maybe that's why his story felt so heavy, so final. Maybe Titor's words weren't meant to save everyone. Maybe they were meant to save someone. Now imagine the world in 2036. If Titor's future comes to pass, cities are smaller, more fortified. Communities are tight-knit out of necessity, not choice. The internet is a ghost of what it once was, no longer a sprawling web of instant connection, but a guarded, localized network, each node watching for threats. There's no illusion of globalism anymore. Nations are memories, and survival is the only shared language. Children grow up knowing how to mend tools, purify water, and farm land they will never truly own. Old maps are relics, showing borders that mean nothing. People measure distance not in miles, but in days of walking. And in that world, there are no debates about whether the warning was true, because the evidence is everywhere, in the ruined bridges and silent highways. But here's where the final shiver runs down the spine. What if we're already walking toward that version of 2036, and no one notices because we are doing it one small compromise at a time? We tell ourselves we'd know if the end was near, but endings rarely announce themselves with sirens. They creep. A policy here, a blackout there, a technology we welcome into our homes without reading the terms. By the time we recognize the pattern has already closed around us. And so, the question that lingers isn't, was John Titor real? It's something quieter, heavier. What would you do if you believed him? Would you shrug and go back to your scrolling? Would you write it off as paranoia? Or would you change, knowing that change is hard, thankless, and invisible until the day it saves you? In the end, the truth about 2036 may never arrive in a headline or a breaking news segment. It may come quietly, in the form of small, irreversible shifts. A river that no longer reaches the sea. A government that quietly redraws its borders. A technology that rewrites the rules before we even understand the old ones. John Titor, if that was his real name, might have been a hoaxer, or a soldier, or just a man who saw something coming and could not bear to keep it to himself. His warning might have been nothing more than an elaborate story, or it might have been the most important message of the early 21st century. The tragedy is that we will only know for certain when it's too late to change anything. And perhaps that was always the point. So now, as you hear these final words and look toward the years ahead, ask yourself one thing. If the knock on your door came tomorrow, if a voice from 2036 told you the clock was running out, would you be ready to listen? Or would you wait, as so many before us have waited, until the warning becomes the history you wished you could rewrite? 2036 is coming. The only question is, whose version will arrive?